What kind of sin could shake heaven so deeply, that God decided to flood the entire earth? Before the rain ever fell, before Noah picked up a single piece of wood, there was a darkness rising. A strange, forbidden chapter in the Bible that most people skip. It sounds like a myth, something out of ancient legend, but it's right there, hidden in the book of Genesis. A story of divine beings coming down to earth, taking human wives, and fathering a race of giants. They're called the NEPHILIM. Even the name sounds mysterious. Shadowy. Ancient. But who were they? And why did their existence provoke such a drastic, almost cosmic response from God? Genesis 6 gives us only a glimpse, a few verses that raise more questions than answers. It speaks of the sons of God, who saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took them as wives. The result? A generation of mighty men, men of renown, but also, according to many scholars, the beginning of humanity's downfall. It's one of the most controversial passages in all of Scripture. So let me ask you, have you ever heard a sermon on this? Most people haven't. Maybe because it's too strange. Maybe because it forces us to look beyond the world we can see. Or maybe, just maybe, because it hints at a spiritual rebellion much bigger than we thought. A rebellion that didn't begin with Adam and Eve, but with heavenly beings who crossed a forbidden line. The NEPHILIM weren't just giants in stature, they were giants in corruption. Their presence infected the earth, distorted the human story, and pushed creation toward collapse. God didn't just see sin in man's heart, he saw something deeper, something unnatural, something dangerous. Something that didn't belong. So when God declared that he was grieved and that he would wipe out mankind from the face of the earth, was he also judging something else? We often read the story of the flood as a tale of moral failure, a world that turned to violence, lust, and selfishness. But what if that's only part of it? What if the real danger came from this hidden incursion, from spiritual beings who altered the fabric of creation? What if the flood was not only a punishment, but a purification? The story of the NEPHILIM is more than a footnote. It's a warning. A clue. A crack in the surface of reality that reveals a much deeper battle being fought, one between the forces of heaven and the dark rebellion that tried to defy it. And it's only the beginning. In this series, we'll dive deep into the mystery. We'll explore ancient texts, both biblical and extra-biblical. We'll uncover what the early Jews, the early Christians, and even cultures outside the Bible believed about these giants. And we'll ask the most important question of all. What does it mean for us, today? Because if you think the NEPHILIM are just a myth from long ago, you might be missing the giants that still walk among us. Now, let's go back. To where it all began. Before the giants. Before the flood. Before the fall. To the moment when angels looked down, and decided to rebel. Before there were giants, there were watchers. Genesis 6 calls them sons of God. Not men. Not prophets. Sons of God. The Hebrew term used here is bnei Elohim, a phrase that appears in other parts of Scripture to describe angelic beings. These weren't just holy messengers floating around with harps. These were powerful, spiritual entities, created by God to observe, protect, and oversee His creation. But some of them didn't stay in their place. They looked down from their heavenly post and saw something they weren't supposed to desire. Women. Human women. And what started as fascination quickly turned into obsession. According to ancient Jewish tradition, especially the Book of Enoch, a text that, while not included in the biblical canon, was widely read and respected in early Jewish and Christian circles, there was a group of 200 angels known as the Watchers. They descended to Mount Hermon and made a pact. A terrifying, rebellious agreement. If we fall together. They knew the price. They knew the risk. But they were ready to abandon their divine nature for flesh, for lust, for control. Their leader. An angel named Semjaza, or Shemaiah. A being once full of light, now driven by dark desire. Alongside him, another powerful figure, Azazel, who would later become known as one of the darkest names in apocryphal lore. Azazel taught mankind how to make weapons, armor, and even cosmetics, tools of both violence and vanity. They weren't just corrupting DNA, they were corrupting civilization. These angels took wives from among humans. And their union produced something unnatural, something never intended by God. The Nephilim. Giants, yes. But not just physically. These were beings born of two worlds. They weren't merely human and they weren't truly angelic. They were something else entirely. Creatures of immense power, terrifying appetites, and spiritual weight. Their presence poisoned the earth. But here's where it gets even deeper. This wasn't just a story of rebellion, it was a counter-creation. A rival storyline. God created humanity in his image, with purpose, order, and divine breath. The Watchers sought to twist that. They wanted their own legacy, their own offspring, their own throne on the earth. This wasn't about lust. It was about dominion. The Book of Enoch paints a grim picture. It says the Nephilim began to devour everything, animals, crops, even humans. Their hunger was insatiable. The earth cried out, and the heavens took notice. God saw what had happened. And this time, it wasn't just human sin. It was angelic rebellion. A direct assault on his design. So what did he do? According to Enoch, he sent archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, to respond. It was a heavenly intervention. A divine cleanup. The Watchers were bound, judged, and cast into a dark abyss. A place of confinement that the New Testament refers to as Tartarus, a prison for rebellious angels, even more terrifying than hell itself. And their children, the Nephilim, were wiped out. Or at least, most of them. But we'll get to that later. For now, understand this, the rebellion in Genesis 6 wasn't just a human one. It was celestial. It was the moment when heaven's boundaries were broken. A cosmic mutiny. And it shook the entire fabric of creation. And it still echoes. That's why this story matters. It's not just mythology. It's not a fable to scare children. It's a shadowy thread that runs through the entire biblical narrative. A glimpse into a war most people never talk about, but one that's far from over. Because when spiritual beings fall, the impact is never small. And as we move forward, we'll see just how deep that impact went. How these hybrid beings, these Nephilim, began to dominate the ancient world, distort the image of God in man, and leave behind ruins of a civilization too corrupt to be saved. Unless God started over. So let's meet them face to face. Who were the Nephilim? Giants? Monsters? Symbols of something even darker? Let's find out. They weren't supposed to exist. Born from the union between heavenly beings and mortal women, the Nephilim were an anomaly. Their very existence was a defiance of the natural order. But what were they, really? Let's start with the name. Nephilim comes from the Hebrew root naphal, meaning to fall. So, the term is often translated as, the fallen ones. But fallen from where? From grace? From heaven? From humanity's trust? Maybe, all of the above. Some interpret the name as a reference to their angelic fathers, fallen angels. Others believe it refers to the Nephilim themselves, as beings who brought destruction and caused others to fall. Either way, the message is clear, these were not heroes. They were harbingers of chaos. Genesis 6 verse 4 describes them as, the mighty men of old, men of renown. Sounds heroic, right? But dig deeper. Ancient Jewish texts paint them as tyrants, not champions. They were beings of enormous size, brutal strength, and disturbing appetites. Their power wasn't used to protect. It was used to dominate. Imagine a world where these giants walked the earth, towering, ruling, and devouring. They didn't just eat food. According to the Book of Enoch, they devoured mankind. Civilization was crumbling under the weight of their violence. But were they literally giants? That's where things get more complex. Some scholars say yes, pointing to the word giants used in many Bible translations, and to ancient records describing warriors and rulers of enormous size. Think of Goliath, the Philistine champion who stood over 9 feet tall. Or the Anakim and Rephaim, tribes linked to the Nephilim who terrified even the Israelite spies sent into Canaan. Other interpretations suggest the term was symbolic. That the Nephilim represented people with immense power, demonic influence, or both. Perhaps they weren't always physically massive, but spiritually monstrous. Their legacy was one of terror, domination, and spiritual corruption. Now here's where things get even more intriguing. Across ancient cultures, from Mesopotamia to Greece to the Americas, there are stories of giant beings who came down from the heavens, mixed with humans, and shaped civilizations. The Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki. The Greeks had the Titans. The Book of Giants, discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, echoes the same storyline: hybrid beings who wreaked havoc on Earth. Coincidence? Or distant memories of the same forbidden event? Even the early church fathers wrestled with this. Writers like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and Tertullian believed the Nephilim were literal offspring of fallen angels and women. It wasn't until later, during the rise of allegorical interpretation, that some began to view the sons of God as simply the descendants of Seth mixing with the line of Cain. But that view raises more questions than it answers. Why would that kind of union produce giants? Why would it provoke such a violent response from God? Why would it require a global flood to wipe them out? No, something much darker was happening. These Nephilim weren't just larger than life, they were unnatural. They didn't fit into the categories God had created, angel or man, spiritual or physical, divine or earthly. They were something in between. A blasphemous fusion that tainted not just the gene pool, but the very image of God in creation. And maybe that's why they had to go. Because as we'll see next, their presence wasn't just a physical threat, it was a spiritual infection. A spreading corruption that affected every corner of the world, every human heart, every ounce of hope left in the world. Until only one man stood apart. One man still walked with God. One man still carried the original image, untainted. His name was Noah. Noah may have walked with God. But he walked through a world drowning in darkness. After the rise of the Nephilim, the earth wasn't just broken, it was twisted. Corruption had seeped into every corner of creation. The people, the animals, even the earth itself, nothing was untouched. Genesis 6 verse 5 pulls no punches. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Let that sink in. Every inclination. Only evil. All the time. This wasn't just about people making mistakes or slipping up morally. It was a total collapse of spiritual order. The divine boundaries God had set, between heaven and earth, spirit and flesh, good and evil, had been violated. And the result was a world that looked nothing like the one he had spoken into being. The Book of Enoch describes a planet overrun by violence, magic, bloodshed, and forbidden knowledge. The fallen angels, called the Watchers, had taught humans things they were never meant to know. Spells. Weapons. Sorcery. Manipulation of nature. Creation was no longer innocent. It had become a playground for rebellion. And God, grieved. That's the word Genesis 6 verse 6 uses. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. Can you imagine that? The Creator, broken-hearted. Not angry at first, but wounded. It wasn't just the sin, it was the betrayal. He had breathed life into humanity. Walked with them in the cool of the day. Watched them grow, choose, stumble, and rise. And now, They had chosen to become something else. Something inhuman. The NEPHILIM, in particular, represented this ultimate defiance. They were living proof that heaven had rebelled, and that earth had joined the cause. But here's where it gets even more chilling. The Bible tells us that all flesh had corrupted its way, not just humans. That suggests a deeper tampering. A biological, even spiritual mutation spreading through the world. Some scholars believe the fallen angels had contaminated the genetic line, seeking to disrupt God's plan entirely, especially his promise of a future Redeemer. Think about that. What if the goal wasn't just chaos? What if it was to stop the coming of Christ before it ever began? If the human bloodline was no longer pure, no longer fully human, then how could the promised seed of the woman ever come? The Messiah couldn't be born from a hybrid race. The enemy's strategy was more than violence. It was genetic warfare. So, God decided to reset. Not out of hatred, but out of mercy. To preserve the last flicker of light. The last family uncorrupted by the darkness. The last breath of the image he had lovingly shaped from the dust. Noah wasn't perfect. But he was blameless in his generation. And that word, generation, might mean more than just his moral character, it could also imply he was free from the corruption that had spread everywhere else. So God gave him a task. A rescue plan. A floating sanctuary in the middle of a spiritual storm. But before the rain fell, before the ark was sealed, he gave the world one last chance. Because even in his judgment, God is still just. Still loving. Still waiting. But the world didn't listen. And so, the skies opened. The earth cracked. And the greatest cleansing the world has ever known began. But was it just a flood of water? Or a spiritual purge, meant to erase the infection the NEPHILIM had unleashed? Rain. Not a gentle drizzle. But a relentless, unstoppable downpour. To most people, it looked like a natural disaster. But make no mistake, this was divine judgment. Not just on humans, but on something much older, deeper, and darker. We often picture the flood as a punishment for sin, and it was. But what if it was more than that? What if it was a cosmic reset? A global exorcism? Let's go back. God had already declared his heartbreak. I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, Genesis 6 verse 7. But he wasn't just referring to human beings. The text says, people and animals and creatures that move along the ground, and the birds in the sky. Why? What had they done? Unless, they had been corrupted, too. Remember what we saw in Genesis 6 verse 12. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. That word, all, keeps showing up. Over and over again. And in the ancient book of Enoch, the description is even more intense. It talks about how the fallen angels taught sorcery, weaponry, astrology, enchantments, and unnatural science. They polluted the earth and its creatures. They unleashed violence, vanity, destruction, and worst of all, spiritual confusion. It wasn't just a moral problem. It was a spiritual infection. And the NEPHILIM? They were the disease in its most aggressive form. Beings that weren't fully human, yet walked among men. Tyrants. Cannibals. Manipulators of nations. They were the manifestation of rebellion, the children of heaven's betrayal and earth's compromise. That's why the flood wasn't just punishment. It was surgery. It was God saying, this cannot continue. I have to protect what's left. So he calls Noah. Noah, the one man whose heart still beat in rhythm with God's. A man who walked upright in a world that crawled in shadows. He and his family were chosen not because they were flawless, but because they were preserved, both morally and, perhaps, genetically. The ark wasn't just a boat. It was a preservation vault. A holy womb that carried humanity, untainted and protected, through the judgment waters. Then it began. The fountains of the great deep burst open. The windows of heaven split apart. And for 40 days and 40 nights, the earth was swallowed by water. But under the surface of this flood was something even more powerful. A spiritual cleansing. Every mountain that had hosted Nephilim. Every kingdom ruled by hybrid kings. Every altar corrupted by blood magic and fallen wisdom. Gone. God wasn't just washing the earth, he was purging history. And the spiritual realm responded. The book of Enoch describes how God bound the fallen angels, casting them into a deep abyss, a prison of darkness until the final judgment. Jude 1 verse 6 confirms this strange truth. And the angels who did not keep their proper domain. He has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. So, while Noah floated on the waves, something deeper was happening beneath the surface. The spiritual architecture of the world was being rewired. The infection was being contained. But here's the question that shakes us even today. Was it permanent? Because when the waters receded, when the ark rested on dry ground, and Noah stepped out into a new beginning, some things still lingered. Pride. Rebellion. Violence. Fear. And even worse, whispers. Whispers of giants still roaming the earth. Whispers of Nephilim, after the flood. But how? Did something survive? They weren't supposed to be there. Not after everything that happened. Not after the flood. And yet, centuries later, the people of Israel, tired, wandering, anxious, reach the edge of the promised land. Moses sends out spies to scout the territory. And when they return, they speak with trembling voices. We saw the Nephilim there. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Numbers 13:33. Wait. Nephilim? Again? How is that possible? That verse has haunted theologians for generations. Did some Nephilim survive the flood? Or, did they return? Let's unpack this mystery. The clues in Scripture. First, the verse doesn't shy away. It names the Nephilim directly, as if everyone already knew who they were. That's significant. And then there's the reference to the Anakim, a tribe described as giants, descendants of Anak, who himself may have been tied to the ancient hybrid bloodlines. Later, in Deuteronomy 2 and 3, we meet other giant clans. Rephaim, shadowy figures of enormous stature. Emim, the terrible ones. Zamzummim, fierce warriors with supernatural reputation. These weren't exaggerations. These were real threats that terrified seasoned warriors. But maybe the biggest shock comes in 1 Samuel 17, where a young shepherd named David faces a Philistine champion, Goliath. A giant. Not metaphorically. Literally. The Bible says he stood 6 cubits and a span, tall, around 9 feet, 9 inches. He carried a spear like a weaver's rod and armor that weighed more than most men. And Goliath wasn't alone. He had brothers. And they, too, were giants. So, were they remnants of the Nephilim? Many believe so. A new wave? Or a spiritual lineage? Now, here's where things get deeper. Some scholars suggest there was a second incursion, a repeat of Genesis 6. That even after the flood, other fallen angels may have descended and defied God again, repeating the ancient sin. Others believe the bloodline of the Nephilim somehow survived through wives taken onto the ark, unmentioned in the text but speculated by some. But there's also a third possibility. The Nephilim didn't return in flesh and blood, but as a spiritual legacy, a corrupting force that passed through kingdoms, bloodlines, and ideologies. Consider this: Goliath came from Gath, a Philistine city known for its violent worship of false gods. The Philistines were deeply involved in occult practices, blood rituals, and spiritual perversion. Could it be that the spirit of the Nephilim lingered, not in their DNA, but in their doctrine? It's not just about height. It's about influence. The giants that Israel faced weren't just large men. They were gatekeepers of evil. They represented spiritual dominions, resistance to God's promises. And over time, God instructed his people to eliminate them completely. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. These beings were dangerous in ways that transcended the battlefield. They were the last shadows of a rebellion that started in heaven and fell through the clouds. Echoes in ancient texts. This isn't just a biblical theme. In the Book of Giants, part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we read about the children of the Watchers, NEPHILIM, crying out in fear as the flood approached. Some tried to escape judgment. Others, according to ancient legends, may have had their spirits bound to the earth. In Babylonian mythology, we find tales of monstrous demigods and hybrid kings. In Greek lore, the Titans and their offspring mirror the same story, divine beings mating with mortals, producing creatures too powerful for the world to handle. It's as if every ancient civilization remembers something, a shared trauma burned into the collective memory of mankind. But for the people of Israel, it was more than myth. It was warfare. They had to face giants, not only with swords, but with faith. And with each battle, something became clearer. These giants weren't just obstacles, they were assignments. They were barriers between God's people and God's promises. And guess what? That pattern hasn't changed. Because even now, there are giants we must confront. Not of flesh and bone, but of spirit, influence, and rebellion. You see, the Nephilim were never just a matter of ancient history or physical confrontation. They were part of a spiritual rebellion, a deep, calculated opposition to the divine narrative. Because when fallen angels took women and birthed giants, they weren't just breaking celestial boundaries. They were doing something far more dangerous. They were trying to corrupt the bloodline. Why? Because from the very beginning, God had a plan. A promise. The seed of the woman will crush the serpent's head. Genesis 3 verse 15. That's not just poetic prophecy. It's strategic war language. From the moment God declared that promise, a cosmic clock started ticking. Satan knew that one day, someone would come to destroy his dominion. So what does he do? He tries to pollute the seed. The Nephilim were part of that strategy. They weren't merely giants, they were interruptions in the human lineage. If the human race could be corrupted, there would be no pure line through which the Messiah could come. That's why the presence of Nephilim is always found right before major moves of God. Before the flood. Before Israel enters the promised land. Before David rises. Each time, giants appear, spiritual obstacles wearing human skin. It wasn't coincidence. It was opposition. Divine intervention, a thread of protection. Look closely, and you'll see God always responds. Noah is called blameless in his generation. Some scholars say this refers not just to morality, but to genetic purity amidst a corrupted world. Abraham is chosen to start a nation, a clean beginning after Babel and Canaanite defilement. Israel is commanded to destroy the giant clans, not out of conquest lust, but to protect the spiritual lineage. David slays Goliath, not just for glory, but to push back a spiritual threat tied to ancient evil. Over and over again, God preserves the promise. Because the Nephilim weren't just flesh and bone. They were symbols of resistance, reminders of a deeper war being waged not on the battlefield, but in the unseen. Today's giants wear different faces. And here's where it gets personal. Because while the original Nephilim may no longer walk among us, their spiritual blueprint remains. We face giants today. Not towering warriors, but systems, ideologies, and influences that still try to distort, destroy, and derail the plan of God. Think about it. Pride that elevates self above all else. Corrupt power that silences truth. Cultural idolatries that replace God with fame, sex, or wealth. Movements that redefine truth and confuse identity. These are modern Nephilim, structures of rebellion. Not born from angels and women, but from pride and deception. They stand between us and God's promises. They mock faith. They intimidate. They seem unbeatable. But remember David. He didn't fight Goliath with a sword. He fought with faith, with the name of the Lord as his weapon. And today, that same authority lives in every believer. So the question is no longer, did the Nephilim exist? The real question is, what giants are standing between you and the purpose of God in your life? Because the battle never stopped. It just changed shape. We've talked about giants in ancient times. We've seen them as rebels, as warriors, as living threats to the divine narrative. But now, let's go deeper. Let's bring the lens closer. Because maybe the most dangerous Nephilim aren't the ones we read about in ancient texts. Maybe they're the ones inside us. What if the real confrontation isn't just out there in the world, but happening right now, within your heart? Think about it, every time you feel that pride rise up that says, I don't need God. Every time rebellion whispers, do it your way. Every time bitterness, lust, or ego takes the throne of your soul. A giant takes form. Crossed swords, inner giants, old spirit, new armor. You see, the Nephilim were born from rebellion. They were the offspring of a divine no that was turned into a defiant yes. And that same spirit, that same DNA of defiance, still tries to reproduce itself in the human soul. You don't need an angel to fall for rebellion to rise. All it takes is a compromise. A little agreement with darkness. A little deal with pride. And before you know it, you've birthed a Nephilim inside your life. It may not be 15 feet tall. But it's heavy. It rules your decisions. It mocks your prayers. It laughs at your worship. It becomes a giant that keeps you from moving forward. Brain recognizing the giants by name. So what do they look like? Here are a few modern Nephilim that disguise themselves in our everyday lives. Pride, that refuses to ask for help or forgive. Control, that can't trust God with the unknown. Addiction, that offers pleasure but takes freedom. Fear, that shrinks your calling and silences your courage. Bitterness, that poisons every relationship. Shame, that convinces you you're unworthy of redemption. Sound familiar? These are spiritual giants. They aren't myth. They aren't folklore. They're very real, and they're standing between you and God's promises. Shield the call to spiritual vigilance. This is why the Bible urges us to be watchful, sober-minded, ready. Not because we're being hunted by ancient monsters. But because the old rebellion wears new faces. What the fallen angels did once with human women. Today the enemy does with your mind, your thoughts, your emotions. He plants ideas. He distorts truth. He breeds giants in silence. But here's the hope. You don't have to raise those giants. You don't have to feed them. You can slay them. Because Jesus didn't come just to save you from hell. He came to set you free from every giant that ever ruled you. He is the ultimate giant slayer. Where the Nephilim came to distort the image of God in mankind, Jesus came to restore it. Where the ancient giants came to enslave, Jesus came to liberate. So ask yourself, what Nephilim have you been entertaining? What giants have you allowed to grow quietly in your heart? Because the final confrontation isn't just historical. It's personal. And you weren't created to coexist with giants. You were created to overcome them. You've walked through ancient mysteries. You've seen the rise of the Watchers, the birth of the Nephilim. The judgment of the flood, the echoes of giants after the storm. But now, it's time for the final chapter. Not just a conclusion. A declaration. Because the story of the Nephilim isn't just about giants. It's about God's unstoppable plan to redeem humanity. A plan that no fallen angel, no spiritual hybrid, no rebellion, could cancel. From corruption to redemption. The Nephilim were a distortion of God's design. Their existence was a war cry, an attempt to corrupt what God called good. But God never left the throne. With one flood, he wiped the board clean. With one family, Noah's, he restarted the story. And with one promise, he pointed forward. A Redeemer would come. Not a warrior with a sword, but a lamb with scars. Jesus didn't come to crush nations, he came to crush the serpent's head. And in doing so, he sealed the fate of every spiritual giant that tried to rise against heaven. The real victory. When Jesus died on the cross, it wasn't just a moment in history. It was a cosmic earthquake. A declaration to every rebel spirit, it is finished. The giants that once ruled. Defeated. The watchers who defied the Most High. Bound in chains of darkness. The curse that followed humanity since Eden. Broken. Heaven made its move. And God won. But here's the twist. The victory wasn't just God's. It's yours, too. Giants still fall today. You might not see Nephilim walking your streets. But the spirit behind them still tries to whisper in our generation. In systems that mock God. In ideologies that twist truth. In hearts that choose self over surrender. Yet the same power that drowned the giants before the ark. The same authority that cast down rebellious angels. The same voice that said, "Peace, be still," now lives in you. If you belong to Jesus, you carry the bloodline of victory. You're not called to fear giants. You're called to slay them. So I'll ask you one final question. What giants do you need to bring down today? Is it fear? Addiction? Pride? Unforgiveness? Shame? Whatever name it goes by. It's not bigger than your God. Because the same God who judged the Nephilim, who saved Noah, who sent his son, he's still writing stories of triumph. And yours might just be the next one. If this journey opened your eyes, if it stirred something deep within, don't let it end here. Share this video. Send it to someone facing a giant. And don't forget to subscribe, because we're just getting started. And now, go out and walk like a giant slayer.